Hey there! Tonight, we are diving into something that will make your evening news look like a children's bedtime story. We are exploring Imperial China, not the sanitized version from your high school textbook, but the real thing, where cruelty wasn't a bug in the system, it was the feature. And you probably won't sleep quite the same way after learning what humans are capable of when they believe heaven itself has given them permission to do absolutely anything. So now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. So, you are living in a world where one man claims he is the only person on Earth who can speak directly to heaven. Not metaphorically, literally. The Emperor of China wasn't just a political leader. He was the Son of Heaven, the sole intermediary between the cosmic order and everything beneath it. This wasn't just propaganda. This was the foundational belief system that governed the largest continuous civilization in human history for over 2,000 years. The mandate of heaven sounds almost quaint when you first hear about it, doesn't it? Heaven chooses a worthy ruler, blesses his dynasty, and as long as he governs wisely, the cosmos remains in balance. Natural disasters, famines, rebellions, these were signs that heaven was withdrawing its support. Time for a new dynasty. It's almost democratic in a cosmic sort of way. But here is where this gentle bedtime story becomes a nightmare. If you truly believe you are heaven's chosen representative on earth, then anyone who opposes you isn't just committing treason, they are defying the fundamental order of the universe itself. And what do you do with people who dare to upset cosmic harmony? Well, you certainly don't send them to their room without supper. The mandate of heaven created a feedback loop of absolute power that would make Machiavelli weep with envy. Every act of brutality could be justified as maintaining cosmic order. Every massacre was heaven's will. Every torture session was correcting universal imbalance. The emperor wasn't just killing people, he was performing sacred maintenance on reality itself. The psychological impact of living under the mandate was probably more devastating than any individual act of cruelty. Imagine never knowing if your next interaction with authority might be your last, because heaven itself might have whispered in the emperor's ear that you needed to die. Every natural disaster made everyone nervous, not because of the immediate damage, but because it might signal that heaven was getting antsy, demanding more blood sacrifices to restore cosmic order. And the really delicious irony? The mandate of heaven was originally supposed to be a check on imperial power. The early Chinese philosophers who developed this concept thought they were creating a system where bad rulers would naturally be overthrown by heaven's will, replaced by more virtuous leaders. Instead, they created the most durable justification for absolute power in human history. Of course, heaven was notoriously bad at communication. It never sent clear memos about what it wanted, so emperors had to interpret natural disasters, portents, dreams, and the occasional oracle. Convenient how heaven's will always seemed to align perfectly with whatever the emperor wanted to do anyway. Amazing coincidence, that. The mandate also created what we might call the world's first systematic surveillance state. If heaven was always watching, then earthly representatives needed to watch too. Every subject was potentially a threat to cosmic order. Every whispered complaint could be treasonous disruption of universal harmony. Informants weren't just helpful, they were performing sacred duty. This is where Imperial China becomes genuinely modern in its horror. We think of totalitarian surveillance as a 20th century invention, but the Chinese had figured out the basic principles centuries earlier. The mandate of heaven provided the perfect theological justification for what would later become the tools of modern dictatorship: mass surveillance, ideological purity tests, collective punishment, and the criminalization of dissent as cosmic treason. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, we're still in the setup phase of our nightmare. We've established the theological framework that justified everything that came next. Heaven chose the emperor. The emperor interpreted heaven's will. Opposition to the emperor was opposition to heaven itself. And heaven, apparently, had very strong feelings about the proper way to peel human beings. Sweet drinks so far? We're just getting started. Let's take the founding of the Ming Dynasty, shall we? Zhu Yanzhong, later known as the Hongwu Emperor, started as a peasant rebel. Classic underdog story, right? Poor boy makes good, overthrows the corrupt Mongol Yuan dynasty, establishes a new golden age. Heartwarming stuff. Except, once he got power, he became so paranoid about losing heaven's mandate that he executed roughly 100,000 people during his reign. Not in wars, mind you, but in purges of his own government. His favorite method was something called slow slicing. We'll get into the delicious details of that later. But for now, just imagine you're a mid-level bureaucrat who filled out a form incorrectly, and your punishment involves being carved up like a holiday roast over the course of several hours while crowds gather to watch. All because heaven apparently told the emperor that proper paperwork was crucial to cosmic harmony. The beauty, if we can call it that, of the mandate system was its self-reinforcing logic. When things went well, it proved heaven approved of the emperor's methods, no matter how horrific they were. When things went badly, it meant heaven was testing the emperor's resolve, requiring even more extreme measures to restore balance. It was a theological mousetrap with no escape clause. But here's what's really fascinating. This wasn't some primitive barbarity that civilization eventually outgrew. The mandate of heaven lasted, in various forms, until 1912. That's roughly 2 millennia of institutionalized divine dictatorship. Your great-grandparents could have been alive when this system finally collapsed. We're not talking about ancient history here. We're talking about the childhood memories of people whose grandchildren are still alive today. Now that we have established heaven's rather flexible communication style, let's meet the people who decided to turn divine mandate into something resembling a factory assembly line for human misery. The Qin dynasty, and no, that's not a typo for Qin, though they did give China its name, lasted only 15 years, from 221 to 206 BCE. But oh, what a productive 15 years they were. The Qin didn't just stumble into systematic cruelty, they had a philosophy for it. Legalism wasn't about lawyers and courtrooms, it was a political theory that made Machiavelli look like a Sunday school teacher. The basic premise was beautifully simple. Humans are fundamentally selfish and stupid, so the only way to create order is through absolute terror backed by inescapable surveillance. Han Feizi, one of legalism's founding theorists, wrote that a proper ruler should be like a tiger, beautiful, powerful, and absolutely unpredictable. Your subjects should love you like they love fire, useful when controlled, terrifying when it gets too close. The goal wasn't just obedience, It was to create a population so paralyzed by fear that they couldn't even imagine disobedience. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, took these theories and ran with them like a child with scissors. He standardized everything: currency, writing systems, weights and measures, and most importantly, methods of punishment. Before the Qin, cruelty was inefficient, localized, amateur hour stuff. The Ten industrialized it. Take their approach to collective punishment, which they called the mutual responsibility system. Every 5 families were grouped together and held responsible for each other's behavior. If one person committed a crime, all 5 families could be executed. Not just the criminals, everyone. Grandmothers, babies, the family dog if they were feeling thorough. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about turning every neighborhood into a collection of terrified prison guards watching each other. The psychological genius of the system is almost admirable in its efficiency. Why hire thousands of secret police when you can turn every citizen into an informant? Your neighbor wasn't just your neighbor anymore. They were a potential death sentence walking around in human form. Family dinners became exercises in mutual surveillance. Children learned to report their parents' suspicious conversations. Parents watched their children's faces for signs of dangerous thinking. But the Qin weren't satisfied with amateur neighborhood snitching. They created professional categories of informants with official ranks and rewards. Successful informants got promoted in the imperial bureaucracy. The most effective spies got land grants. Turning in your own family members was considered the highest form of patriotic virtue. Here is where it gets deliciously absurd. They had different types of informants for different social levels. Peasant informants watched other peasants. Merchant informants watched merchants. Scholar informants watched scholars. Even the informants had informants watching them. It was surveillance systems all the way down, like some kind of totalitarian Russian nesting doll. The punishment system itself was a work of art. The Qin cataloged crimes with the precision of a modern tax code. They had 36 different categories of execution, each calibrated to the specific type of social disruption the crime represented. Stealing grain got you a different death than stealing silk, which got you a different death than stealing Imperial chickens. They pioneered what we might call educational execution. Public deaths designed to teach specific lessons to specific audiences. Rebellious scholars were buried alive at book-burning ceremonies so other intellectuals could watch knowledge and its creators disappear together. Corrupt officials were boiled in oil in front of the government buildings where they'd worked, turning their former workplace into their final performance venue. But perhaps their most innovative contribution was bureaucratizing torture. Before the Qin, torture was an art form practiced by individual sadists. The Qin turned it into a science with standardized procedures, official handbooks, and professional training programs. They had torture specialists who studied anatomy to maximize pain while minimizing the risk of accidental death. You couldn't just wing it anymore. Proper torture required education and certification. The Qin legal code, all of it, mind you, has been lost to history, which is probably for the best, considering what we know about their other innovations. But fragments survive, and they're genuinely impressive. They had laws governing everything from the proper way to mourn dead relatives to the acceptable length of sword handles. Break any law, trigger the mutual responsibility system, and suddenly entire neighborhoods vanish. What's particularly charming about Qin legalism is how they dealt with the inevitable problem of false accusations. Since everyone was incentivized to inform on everyone else, people started making things up to earn rewards or settle personal grudges. The Qin solution? If you made a false accusation, you received the same punishment your victim would have gotten if they'd been guilty. Accuse someone of treason falsely, you get executed for treason. It was elegant in a psychotic sort of way. Emperor Qin Shi Huang himself embodied the paranoid perfection of his own system. He had 270 palaces and moved between them randomly, so assassins couldn't predict his location. He never slept in the same room twice. He had food tasters, but also food taster tasters, and probably food taster taster tasters. The man who had created the most comprehensive surveillance state in history was terrified that someone might be watching him. The irony, of course, is that all this systematic terror was supposed to create perfect order and stability. Instead, the Qin dynasty collapsed almost immediately after the first emperor's death. Turns out, when you base your entire government on fear, people tend to revolt the moment they sense weakness. Who could have predicted that? The Qin only lasted 15 years, but their innovations in systematic oppression influenced Chinese governance for the next 2 millennia. Every subsequent dynasty borrowed their techniques, refined their methods, and improved their efficiency. The mutual responsibility system kept popping up throughout Chinese history like a particularly persistent rash. The Qin proved that with the right combination of ideology, bureaucracy, and creative sadism, you could terrorize hundreds of millions of people with remarkable efficiency. They turned cruelty from a personal vice into a professional discipline. And that, dear listeners, brings us to our next chapter. What happens when you combine systematic oppression with genuine artistic creativity in the field of human destruction? Because if you thought the Qin were bad, wait until you hear what Imperial China did when they really put their minds to the problem of killing people in interesting ways. Remember those 36 categories of execution we mentioned? Well, settle in, because we're about to explore what happens when you give creative people unlimited resources and a mandate from heaven to think outside the box when it comes to ending human lives. Imperial China didn't just kill people, they turned death into performance art. Let's start with the star of the show, Ling Qi. Often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, though that's really selling it short. The Chinese name literally means slow slicing, and it was exactly what it sounds like. The executioner would make small, precise cuts all over the victim's body, carefully avoiding vital organs, keeping them conscious and aware for as long as possible. The whole process could take hours, sometimes days, if the executioner was particularly skilled. But here's what makes Ling Qi genuinely fascinating from a historical perspective. It wasn't just random sadism. It was a carefully choreographed ritual with specific rules, traditional techniques, and professional standards. Master executioners passed down cutting patterns like family recipes. There were debates among scholars about the proper number of cuts for different crimes. Some regions developed their own distinctive styles, like regional cuisines, but for human dismemberment. The process typically began with cuts to the chest and arms, areas with lots of nerve endings, but not immediately fatal. Then the executioner would work systematically across the body, removing small pieces of flesh with each cut. The victim was usually given opium beforehand, not out of mercy, but to prevent them from passing out too quickly and spoiling the show. Can't have educational torture if the student falls asleep during the lesson. What's particularly charming is how Ling Qi became a spectator sport. Crowds would gather to watch, vendors would sell snacks, and wealthy families would rent balconies overlooking the execution ground. It was like a medieval food court, except the main course was a living human being, and everyone brought their own chopsticks to point with. But Ling Chi was just one item on an extensive menu of creative death. Imperial China also perfected the art of boiling people alive, and they approached it with the same systematic thoroughness they brought to everything else. Different crimes got different cooking methods. Some people were boiled in oil, others in water. The temperature was carefully controlled to ensure maximum consciousness during the process. They had professional boilers whose job was to maintain the perfect temperature. Hot enough to cause excruciating pain, not so hot that death came quickly. Then there was the bamboo torture, which sounds almost pleasant until you understand the mechanics. Victims were tied down over freshly planted bamboo shoots. Bamboo, as you may know, is one of the fastest growing plants on Earth. Some species can grow 3 feet in a single day. The shoots would slowly pierce through the victim's body over the course of several days, growing through them like they were just another patch of soil. It was death by gardening, essentially. The really innovative executioners developed combination methods. Why settle for one type of torture when you can layer them like a parfait of human suffering? There are records of criminals being partially flayed, then covered in honey and tied near anthills, then left in the sun to be slowly devoured by insects while dying of dehydration. It was like a tasting menu for sadists. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating execution method was something called family extermination. When someone committed certain types of treason, the punishment extended to their entire family line, not just parents and children, but grandparents, cousins, in-laws, and sometimes even close friends. The condemned person would be forced to watch their entire extended family being executed before their own death. Imagine being responsible not just for your own death, but for the deaths of everyone you'd ever loved. The bureaucracy around these executions was almost as elaborate as the executions themselves. There were official manuals detailing proper techniques, government inspectors who evaluated executioner performance, and detailed records kept of every execution. The Imperial archives contain thousands of execution reports, filed by date, method, and crime category like some kind of death-themed library system. What's genuinely disturbing is how execution became a form of imperial entertainment. Emperors would sometimes attend executions personally, and particularly creative or prolonged deaths were considered special occasions. There are records of execution-themed banquets where guests would dine while watching criminals die in the courtyard below. Nothing says sophisticated civilization like dinner and a dismemberment. The Chinese also pioneered psychological torture techniques that were arguably more cruel than physical methods. They developed something called anticipatory execution, where condemned criminals would be brought to the execution ground repeatedly, sometimes for weeks, and then returned to their cells at the last minute. The psychological torture of expecting death over and over again often drove people insane before they were finally executed. They also perfected the art of executing people in front of their families, but with a twist. Sometimes they would execute the family members first and force the primary condemned person to watch, and sometimes they would execute the primary person first and force the family to watch. The choice of order was itself a form of additional punishment, carefully calculated to maximize psychological trauma. But here's what's really remarkable. All of this creativity and systematic cruelty was considered a normal part of governance. These weren't aberrations or excesses. They were standard operating procedures. Law students studied execution methods the way modern law students study contract law. Government officials were expected to be familiar with torture techniques as part of their basic professional competency. The manuals and handbooks that survive from Imperial China read like instruction guides for nightmare factories. They discuss the proper sharpening of cutting instruments, the optimal restraint methods for different body types, and the correct procedures for maintaining victim consciousness during extended torture sessions. It's all written in the same dry, bureaucratic language you'd expect from a government employee handbook. And remember, this entire system existed within a culture that prized learning, poetry, and philosophical sophistication. The same dynasties that produced exquisite art, groundbreaking literature, and profound philosophical insights also maintained professional torture academies and execution research departments. It's as if someone combined Harvard University with a medieval torture chamber and called it good governance. The really unsettling part is how normal it all became. Execution methods that would shock modern audiences were considered routine administrative procedures. People planned their daily schedules around public executions the way we plan around traffic reports. Children grew up thinking that watching strangers die in elaborate ways was just part of community life. If you thought those execution methods were creative, wait until you hear about the Chinese solution to palace security. Why worry about guards being seduced or corrupted when you can just surgically remove their ability to be seduced in the first place? Welcome to the world of Imperial eunuchs, where career advancement literally required cutting off your manhood. The logic was beautifully simple and absolutely horrifying. The emperor needed servants who could never father dynasties of their own, never seduce imperial women, and never pose a biological threat to the royal bloodline. The solution? Create a permanent class of men who weren't quite men anymore, who had traded their reproductive capacity for proximity to ultimate power. But here's what makes the eunuch system particularly fascinating. It wasn't forced on people. Men volunteered for castration. They lined up for it. Families saved money to pay for the privilege of having their sons surgically mutilated. Because in Imperial China, becoming a eunuch was often the only path to real power for men who weren't born into nobility. The castration process itself was a medical marvel in the worst possible way. The operation was performed by specialists called knife wielders. And yes, that was their actual job title, which tells you something about Chinese attitudes toward workplace euphemisms. The entire external genitalia were removed with a single cut using a small curved blade. No anesthesia, naturally. The wound was then cauterized with boiling oil or hot metal. The survival rate was roughly 50%. Think about that for a moment. Half of the people who underwent this procedure died from it. And yet the demand was so high that knife wielders could charge premium prices and still have waiting lists. Men were literally dying for the chance to maybe, possibly, eventually gain access to imperial power. The recovery process was particularly charming. The fresh wound was covered with a lead plug and paper soaked in cold water. The patient wasn't allowed to urinate for 3 days. Yes, 3 full days to allow the urethra to heal properly. If they could urinate on the 4th day, they'd probably survive. If they couldn't, they'd die of kidney failure or blood poisoning. It was like Russian roulette, but with medical complications instead of bullets. But here's the really twisted part. Successful eunuchs had to keep their severed genitals in a jar as proof of their castration. These were called precious and were considered essential career documents. Imagine having to bring your own severed penis to job interviews. The genitals were often buried with the eunuch when they died, because traditional Chinese beliefs held that you needed to be complete in the afterlife. So these men spent their entire careers carrying around the body parts they'd sacrificed for success. The eunuch hierarchy within the palace was incredibly complex. There were different ranks of eunuchs with different responsibilities and different levels of access to the emperor. The highest rank eunuchs were essentially running the empire from behind the scenes, while the lowest ranks were basically janitors who happened to be missing their reproductive organs. What's particularly fascinating is how eunuchs developed their own subculture within the palace. They created elaborate adoption networks since they couldn't have biological children. Senior eunuchs would adopt younger ones, creating artificial family structures to replace the biological families they could never have. Some eunuchs even adopted multiple sons and created complex inheritance systems for passing down their positions and wealth. The most powerful eunuchs became incredibly wealthy and influential. They controlled access to the emperor, managed imperial finances, and essentially functioned as a shadow government. Some eunuchs accumulated more real power than actual princes. But that power came with a constant awareness of what they'd lost to get it. Every day was a reminder of the price they'd paid for influence. The psychological impact of castration went far beyond the physical trauma. Many eunuchs developed what we might recognize today as complex gender identity issues. They weren't quite men, but they weren't women either. They existed in a third category that Chinese society had created specifically for them. Some eunuchs adopted feminine behaviors and clothing. Others became hyper-masculine in compensation for their loss. Most fell somewhere in between, creating new ways of being human that didn't quite fit traditional categories. The emperor's relationship with his eunuchs was equally complex. These were the only men he could trust because they posed no biological threat to his dynasty. But they were also constant reminders of the lengths people would go to for power. Every conversation with a eunuch was a conversation with someone who had voluntarily mutilated themselves for the privilege of serving him. Some eunuchs wielded enormous informal power through their intimate access to the emperor. They were present during the most private moments of imperial life: dressing, bathing, eating, sleeping. This intimacy gave them opportunities to influence imperial decisions that no other officials enjoyed. A whispered suggestion during the emperor's morning routine could change the course of history. But the eunuch system also created its own forms of corruption and intrigue. Eunuchs competed viciously with each other for imperial favor, since their entire identity and purpose revolved around their relationship with the emperor. Palace politics among eunuchs were legendary for their complexity and cruelty. These were people who had already sacrificed everything for power. They had very little left to lose in political battles. The system reached its peak during the Ming Dynasty, when there were reportedly over 100,000 eunuchs serving in the imperial palace complex. That's an entire city of castrated men, all competing for the attention and favor of a single individual. Can you imagine the psychological atmosphere? The constant tension, the elaborate hierarchies, the desperate attempts to prove value and loyalty by people who had already proven it in the most dramatic way possible? What's really remarkable is how long this system lasted. Eunuchs were a central part of Chinese imperial governance for over 2,000 years. Generation after generation of families made the calculation that castrating their sons was a reasonable investment in their future prospects. It became so normalized that Chinese literature from various dynasties treats eunuch castration as a routine career choice, like deciding between law school and medical school. The eunuch system finally ended with the fall of the imperial system in 1912, but some of the last imperial eunuchs lived well into the 20th century. There are photographs and even some film footage of elderly eunuchs who had served the final emperors. They look like ordinary old men, except for the knowledge of what they'd endured to get where they were. But, as we'll see next, the eunuch system was hardly the only way Imperial China found to systematically mutilate people in the name of social order. Because while the men were voluntarily castrating themselves for career advancement, Chinese families were doing something even more widespread and arguably more cruel to their daughters, all in the name of beauty and marriageability. If you thought voluntary castration was disturbing, let's talk about what Chinese families did to their daughters for nearly 1,000 years. Foot binding wasn't just a beauty practice. It was a systematic campaign to cripple half the population in the name of aesthetic appeal and marriageability. And unlike eunuch castration, which at least offered the possibility of power and wealth, foot binding offered women nothing except pain, disability, and the approval of men who fetishized their inability to walk properly. The process began when girls were between 4 and 6 years old, right when their bones were still soft enough to be permanently deformed. The timing was crucial. Too early, and the bones wouldn't heal properly. Too late, and they wouldn't bend enough to achieve the desired shape. It was a delicate balance between childhood development and deliberate mutilation. Here's how it worked, and fair warning, this is where our bedtime story takes a particular dark turn. The child's feet would be soaked in warm water to soften the skin and bones. Then, all the toes except the big toe would be broken and folded under the foot, pressed against the sole, and bound tightly with cloth strips. The arch of the foot would be broken next, forcing the heel and toes to grow closer together, creating the desired lotus shape. The binding had to be maintained constantly, tightened regularly as the child grew, ensuring that the bones would heal in their new, unnatural position. The process was agonizing. Children would scream, develop infections, sometimes lose toes to gangrene. Many girls begged their mothers to stop, but mothers who loved their daughters continued the process because they knew that unbinding would make their daughters unmarriageable. The ideal result was feet that measured no more than 3 inches long, about the size of a child's fist. These were called golden lotuses and were considered the pinnacle of feminine beauty. Feet between 3 and 4 inches were silver lotuses, acceptable but not ideal. Anything over 4 inches was considered embarrassingly large and would severely limit a woman's marriage prospects. But here's what's particularly insidious about foot binding. It wasn't imposed by male authorities from above. It was maintained by women, passed down from mothers to daughters, enforced by female relatives and neighbors. Women became the primary enforcers of their own oppression, convinced that mutilating their daughters was an act of maternal love and social responsibility. The bound feet had to be maintained throughout a woman's entire life. The bindings could never be permanently removed without the feet losing their shape and becoming even more deformed and painful. Women would spend hours each day unwrapping, cleaning, and rewrapping their feet. The smell was reportedly horrific, a combination of dead flesh, infection, and the herbs used to treat constant wounds. Walking with bound feet required an entirely different gait. Women with bound feet swayed from side to side, taking tiny, mincing steps that men apparently found irresistibly feminine. They couldn't run, couldn't work in fields, couldn't flee from danger. They were literally hobbled, made dependent on others for their most basic mobility needs. And this dependence was considered a virtue. The sexual fetishization of bound feet was extraordinarily elaborate. There were dozens of different terms for different foot shapes, binding styles, and walking gaits. Men wrote poetry about the erotic appeal of watching women struggle to walk. The feet themselves were considered so sexually charged that they were kept covered even during intimacy. The sight of unbound bound feet was supposedly more arousing than nudity. What's remarkable is how the practice spread across Chinese society. It began among the wealthy elite, noble families who could afford to have non-productive daughters, but gradually filtered down through all social classes. Eventually, even peasant families were binding their daughters' feet, despite the economic burden of having women who couldn't perform agricultural labor. The economic implications were staggering. Foot binding essentially removed half the potential workforce from productive labor. Women with bound feet couldn't work in fields, couldn't carry heavy loads, couldn't perform most manual tasks that required mobility. This created a society where women were economically dependent on men, not by choice or social custom, but by deliberate physical incapacitation. Different regions developed their own foot binding styles and preferences. Northern China favored extremely pointed feet, while southern regions preferred wider shapes. Some areas bound feet to curve dramatically, others aimed for specific arch configurations. It was like regional cuisines, except instead of food preparation techniques, families were passing down methods for deforming children's bones. The medical consequences were horrific and lifelong. Women with bound feet suffered from constant pain, frequent infections, difficulty maintaining balance, and severely limited mobility. Many developed chronic health problems from decades of walking improperly. The rate of falls and injuries was enormous. Imagine spending your entire adult life walking on feet that had been deliberately broken and reshaped when you were 5 years old. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was how women were taught to take pride in their disability. Bound feet were a mark of status, femininity, and desirability. Women whose feet had been successfully mutilated looked down on those whose feet were less severely deformed. The victims became advocates for the system that had victimized them. The practice was so normalized that Chinese literature and art from this period treats bound feet as naturally feminine, like having long hair or wearing jewelry. There are thousands of poems celebrating the beauty of women struggling to walk, countless paintings depicting the erotic appeal of tiny shoes, entire genres of art dedicated to romanticizing deliberate disability. Foreign visitors were consistently horrified by foot binding, but their criticism was often dismissed as cultural ignorance. Chinese intellectuals defended the practice as a refined tradition that elevated women above crude physical labor, making them living works of art rather than mere workers. The logic was similar to eunuch castration, voluntary mutilation in service of social ideals. The practice began to decline in the early 20th century as China encountered Western ideas about women's capabilities and rights. But foot binding was officially banned only in 1912 and continued in rural areas for decades afterward. Some of the last women with bound feet died in the 21st century, living connections to nearly a millennium of systematic child abuse disguised as beauty culture. What's most disturbing about foot binding is how it reveals the capacity of societies to normalize extraordinary cruelty when it's framed as tradition, beauty, or social necessity. For 1,000 years, Chinese families convinced themselves that breaking their daughters' bones was an act of love. Mothers who had survived the agony themselves inflicted it on their own children, believing they were preparing them for successful lives. Now that we've explored how Chinese families mutilated their daughters for marriage prospects, let's see what happened to the women who won that particular lottery. The imperial harem system turned women into human collectibles, where being selected for the emperor's attention was simultaneously the ultimate honor and a luxurious form of imprisonment that could last an entire lifetime. The numbers alone are staggering. During the Tang Dynasty, Emperor Xuanzang reportedly had over 40,000 women in his various palaces. That's not a harem. That's a city-sized collection of human beings whose entire existence revolved around the possibility that one man might occasionally notice them. Imagine being one of 40,000 women competing for the attention of a single individual who might see you once or never. The selection process was elaborate and systematic. Imperial scouts traveled throughout the empire looking for beautiful girls, usually between the ages of 13 and 16. But beauty wasn't enough. Candidates had to pass tests of intelligence, artistic ability, and moral character. They were examined like livestock at market, evaluated for everything from their voice quality to their walking gait to their ability to compose poetry on command. Once selected, these women entered a world that was simultaneously luxurious and nightmarish. The imperial palaces were magnificent. Silk curtains, jade ornaments, gardens that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. The women were dressed in the finest clothing, fed the most exotic foods, and given access to education and arts that were denied to most men, let alone women in Chinese society. But here's the catch. They could never leave. Once you entered the imperial harem, you belonged to the emperor for life. There was no retirement, no resignation, no going home to marry someone else. You were imperial property until you died, whether that death came at 20 or 90. The hierarchy within the harem was incredibly complex. There were dozens of different ranks, from the empress at the top down to servant girls at the bottom. Each rank had specific privileges, specific clothing, specific quarters, and specific rules about when and how they could interact with the emperor. Moving up in rank required not just imperial favor, but also navigating the complex politics of thousands of women competing for extremely limited opportunities. Most of these women never even met the emperor. They would spend their entire lives in the palace complex, growing old in service to a man who didn't know they existed. They couldn't marry anyone else. That would be adultery, punishable by death. They couldn't have relationships with other men. That would be treason. They couldn't even have meaningful friendships with eunuchs without risking suspicion and punishment. The psychological pressure was incredible. Imagine living your entire adult life knowing that your only chance for meaning, purpose, or advancement depends on catching the attention of one person who has 40,000 other options. Every day was a competition you were almost certainly going to lose, and losing meant spending the rest of your life in gilded obscurity. The women who did gain imperial favor faced their own unique challenges. Becoming a favored concubine meant becoming a target for the jealousy and schemes of thousands of other women. Palace intrigue among imperial women was legendary for its complexity and ruthlessness. Poison was common. Accidents were frequent. Even pregnancy, supposedly the ultimate goal, could be dangerous, since other concubines might see your unborn child as a threat to their own potential offspring. But the cruelest aspect of the harem system was what happened when emperors died. The tradition of human sacrifice to accompany dead rulers had officially ended by most dynasties, But the practice of forcing imperial women to volunteer for suicide continued in various forms throughout Chinese history. Some women were expected to hang themselves or take poison to demonstrate their loyalty to their dead master. Others were simply sealed into tombs alive. During the Ming Dynasty, when Emperor Yongle died in 1424, 16 of his concubines were forced to hang themselves to accompany him in death. They were given silk cords and told it was their honor and duty to follow their emperor into the afterlife. Those who hesitated were encouraged by palace guards. The whole process was treated as a solemn religious ceremony, complete with prayers and official documentation. What's particularly disturbing is how these forced suicides were romanticized in Chinese literature and art. Stories of concubines joyfully embracing death to remain loyal to their emperors became popular romantic narratives. The reality, terrified young women being murdered by state decree, was transformed into tales of noble sacrifice and transcendent love. Even concubines who survived their emperor's death faced limited options. They were typically moved to special quarters of the palace and expected to spend the rest of their lives in mourning, essentially becoming living widows to men they might have barely known. Some were allowed to become Buddhist nuns, but even this required imperial permission and was considered a lesser form of the ultimate sacrifice of suicide. The economic cost of maintaining these massive harems was enormous. The imperial palaces required armies of servants, eunuchs, guards, and administrators just to manage the daily lives of thousands of women. Food, clothing, entertainment, medical care, security, all of this had to be provided for women whose primary function was to be available in case the emperor wanted company. But perhaps the most wasteful aspect was the lost potential. These harems contained some of the most intelligent, talented, and capable women in the empire, selected specifically for their exceptional qualities, and then systematically prevented them from contributing anything meaningful to society. It was like collecting the finest minds of a generation and using them as decorative objects. The sexual dynamics were equally disturbing. The emperor had unlimited access to thousands of women who had no choice but to comply with his desires. But the system also created its own forms of sexual dysfunction. Many emperors became unable to form genuine emotional connections with women, seeing them only as interchangeable sources of pleasure and validation. The power imbalance was so extreme that meaningful consent was impossible. Some concubines tried to gain influence through their relationships with imperial children, but this created another layer of cruel competition. Women would scheme against each other's children, sometimes resorting to infanticide to eliminate potential rivals. The palace nurseries were reportedly dangerous places, where infant mortality rates were suspiciously high, and accidents befell the children of women who had fallen out of favor. The record-keeping around imperial harems was meticulous and deeply dehumanizing. Palace administrators maintained detailed catalogs of each woman's physical characteristics, sexual preferences, menstrual cycles, and pregnancy history. Women were tracked like breeding stock, with careful notation of their fertility and the emperor's level of interest in their services. What's most remarkable is how this system was simultaneously criticized and romanticized throughout Chinese history. Confucian scholars regularly condemned excessive imperial harems as wasteful and morally corrupting, but the same culture produced endless art and literature celebrating the beauty and tragedy of palace women. The victims became aesthetic objects in their own cultural narratives. The harem system reveals something profound about how Imperial China approached human relationships. Everything was hierarchical, everything was transactional, and everyone existed primarily to serve the needs of the emperor. While the emperor was collecting women like fine porcelain and castrating his servants for convenience, the vast majority of Chinese people, roughly 90% of the population, were peasants whose entire existence revolved around producing enough food and taxes to keep the imperial system running. And the imperial approach to peasant management was a masterclass in systematic extraction that would make modern tax authorities weep with envy. The Chinese peasant lived in a world where everything they produced belonged to someone else first. After the emperor took his share, and the local officials took theirs, and the landlords collected rent, and the moneylenders demanded interest, a typical peasant family might keep maybe 30% of what they actually grew. In good years, this was barely enough to survive. In bad years, it was a death sentence served with bureaucratic efficiency. But the taxes weren't just about grain and money. The corvée labor system required peasants to work for free on imperial projects for a certain number of days each year. Building the Great Wall wasn't just a triumph of engineering, it was a triumph of forced labor extraction. Millions of peasants were dragged away from their farms during crucial planting and harvesting seasons to move stones for the emperor's vanity projects. The psychological genius of the corvée system was how it was framed as patriotic duty. Peasants weren't being exploited, they were contributing to the glory of the empire. They weren't being worked to death, they were participating in great national endeavors. It's remarkable how effective propaganda can be when backed up by the threat of immediate execution for noncompliance. Here's where the math becomes genuinely horrifying. Historians estimate that building the Great Wall required roughly 400,000 workers per year over several centuries. Most of these workers died during construction, from exhaustion, disease, accidents, or simply being worked beyond human endurance. The wall isn't just a monument to Chinese engineering, it's the world's largest cemetery, built from peasant bones and imperial vanity. But corvée labor was just one item on the menu of peasant extraction. There was also the granary system, which sounds benevolent until you understand how it actually worked. The government maintained strategic grain reserves for famine relief, which meant taking even more grain from peasants during good years to prepare for bad ones. Except the grain often rotted in storage while peasants starved, or was sold by corrupt officials while peasants starved, or was redirected to feed armies while peasants starved. Noticing a pattern here? The taxation system was so complex it required professional interpreters. There were taxes on land, taxes on crops, taxes on livestock, taxes on tools, taxes on selling things, taxes on buying things, taxes on moving things from one place to another. There were special taxes for war preparation, special taxes for imperial celebrations, special taxes for natural disasters, and special taxes for the privilege of paying all the other taxes. During the Ming Dynasty, peasants were required to pay taxes in specific types of goods, not just any grain, but particular varieties grown in particular ways. If your local climate couldn't produce the required tax crop, you had to buy it from someone else to pay your taxes, often at inflated prices. It was like being required to pay your modern taxes in Bitcoin, except Bitcoin that might rot before you could deliver it. The really elegant cruelty of the system was how it made peasants complicit in their own oppression. Villages were held collectively responsible for meeting tax quotas. So if one family couldn't pay, their neighbors had to make up the difference, or everyone would be punished. This turned peasant communities into collections of tax collectors, pressuring each other, eliminating the need for extensive imperial bureaucracy at the local level. Famines weren't natural disasters in imperial China. They were policy outcomes. The tax extraction system was so efficient that it regularly removed more food from peasant communities than they could spare. When crops failed, peasants had no reserves because their reserves had been collected as taxes the previous year. When they couldn't eat, they couldn't work. When they couldn't work, they couldn't pay taxes. When they couldn't pay taxes, they were punished for tax evasion. The punishment for tax delinquency was typically forcing the family to sell their land, tools, livestock, and eventually their children into slavery to pay their debts. Entire families would be reduced to begging within a single bad harvest season. And since land ownership was the only path to stability in agricultural societies, losing your land meant your family line was essentially finished. But here's the really insidious part. Chinese cultural values taught peasants that their suffering was morally virtuous. Confucian ideology emphasized acceptance of one's social position, respect for authority, and the idea that enduring hardship with dignity was the highest form of character development. Peasants were taught that complaining about their treatment was morally inferior behavior that demonstrated weak character. The imperial response to peasant rebellions was always the same: overwhelming violence, followed by minor policy adjustments that didn't change the fundamental extraction system. Rebellious peasants weren't treated as people with legitimate grievances. They were treated as natural disasters that required suppression, like floods or locust swarms. During the late Ming period, there were famines so severe that peasants resorted to eating tree bark, grass, and eventually each other. Imperial granaries contained millions of tons of rice, while peasants died of starvation in the surrounding countryside. But selling the reserve grain would have required admitting that the tax system had failed, which would have challenged the mandate of heaven, which was politically impossible. The most disturbing records from Chinese imperial history aren't the accounts of elaborate executions or palace intrigue. They're the matter-of-fact bureaucratic reports about peasant mortality rates during famines. Officials would file reports noting that 60% of the population in a given region had died of starvation, then request tax relief for the survivors, as if mass death was just another administrative challenge to be managed efficiently. What's remarkable is how peasants continued to have children and maintain families, despite living in these conditions. Hope, apparently, is harder to crush than human bodies. Peasant families would continue farming, continue paying taxes, continue participating in corvée labor, continue believing that their children might somehow have better lives, even while knowing that the system was designed to extract everything they produced. The ecological damage was enormous, too. The pressure to maximize tax payments led to unsustainable farming practices, clearing forests, overworking soil, diverting water resources, that created environmental problems lasting for centuries. Peasants weren't just being worked to death individually, their communities were being worked to death collectively. But Imperial China's peasant extraction system was so successful that it supported not just the emperor and his court, but also massive armies, extensive bureaucracies, and some of the largest construction projects in human history. The suffering of hundreds of millions of people was converted into architectural monuments and artistic treasures that still impress tourists today. After centuries of perfecting systematic cruelty in isolation, Imperial China finally encountered other cultures who had been developing their own approaches to organized brutality. The Opium Wars of the mid-19th century weren't just military conflicts. They were a collision between different philosophies of how to efficiently exploit and control human beings. And the results revealed that Chinese cruelty, for all its artistic refinement, had some serious weaknesses when confronted by Western industrial-scale oppression. The British approach to Chinese resistance was refreshingly straightforward. If the Chinese government won't let us sell opium to your people, we'll force them to buy it at gunpoint. There's something almost admirable about the directness of it. No elaborate theological justifications, no complex bureaucratic procedures, no artistic torture methods. Just simple economic imperialism backed by superior firepower and a willingness to create millions of drug addicts for profit. The Chinese discovered that their traditional methods of dealing with foreign barbarians, a combination of cultural condescension and ritualized submission ceremonies, worked less well against people who had cannons and weren't particularly interested in participating in Chinese concepts of cosmic harmony. When British warships started shelling Chinese coastal cities, the mandate of heaven suddenly seemed less relevant than the mandate of superior military technology. What's particularly fascinating is how the two sides misunderstood each other's forms of cruelty. The Chinese were horrified by British willingness to profit from drug addiction, which they saw as corrupting the moral foundation of society. The British were horrified by Chinese torture methods, which they saw as barbarically elaborate and inefficient. Each side was appalled by the other's approach to systematic human suffering, apparently missing the irony. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was essentially a document formalizing Chinese submission to foreign cruelty. China had to pay massive reparations for the privilege of being defeated, cede Hong Kong to Britain, and open multiple ports to foreign trade. But the most humiliating clause was the extraterritoriality provision. Foreign nationals in China would be subject to foreign laws, not Chinese laws. Imagine the psychological impact. After centuries of believing that Chinese civilization was inherently superior to foreign barbarism, Chinese law was suddenly declared inadequate to govern foreigners on Chinese soil. The Second Opium War was even more devastating to Chinese self-image. British and French forces marched directly to Beijing and burned down the Summer Palace, one of the most magnificent architectural complexes in Chinese history. This wasn't just military destruction, it was cultural humiliation designed to demonstrate that Chinese civilization could be casually destroyed by foreign powers whenever convenient. But here's where the story becomes really interesting. Instead of reforming their oppressive systems, Chinese intellectuals initially tried to preserve traditional cruelty while adding Western technology. The self-strengthening movement was based on the idea that China could maintain its traditional imperial system, complete with systematic torture, peasant exploitation, and eunuch bureaucracy, while simply adding Western weapons and industrial techniques. This approach failed spectacularly and for fascinating reasons. Chinese traditional cruelty was based on elaborate cultural and religious justifications that required social consensus to maintain. When that consensus was shattered by foreign military defeats, the entire ideological foundation of imperial oppression began to crumble. You can't maintain a system based on cosmic divine mandate when foreign barbarians are demonstrating that your mandate apparently doesn't include military competence. The psychological impact on Chinese society was devastating. For over 2,000 years, Chinese culture had been organized around the assumption that Chinese civilization was inherently superior to foreign cultures. The imperial system, with all its elaborate cruelties, was justified by this assumed superiority. When Western powers demonstrated clear technological and military advantages, it created an identity crisis that Chinese society is arguably still processing today. Foreign missionaries added another layer of complexity to the situation. They were appalled by Chinese practices like foot binding, infanticide, and public torture, and began campaigns to reform Chinese society. But they were also representatives of cultures that were simultaneously forcing opium addiction on Chinese people and extracting massive economic concessions through military threat. The moral authority was, shall we say, complicated. The Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864, was partially a response to this cultural crisis. Hong Xiuquan, the rebellion's leader, claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ and tried to create a reformed Chinese state that would combine Christian moral principles with Chinese governmental structures. The rebellion controlled most of southern China for over a decade and killed an estimated 20 million people, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. What's remarkable about the Taiping Rebellion is how it demonstrated that Chinese capacity for systematic cruelty could be redirected rather than eliminated. The Taiping government banned foot binding, eliminated the traditional examination system, and promoted gender equality. But they also practiced mass execution of demons, anyone who opposed them, forced religious conversion, and created their own forms of systematic oppression. Different ideology, same fundamental approach to human control. The imperial government's response to the Taiping Rebellion revealed how foreign pressure had actually made traditional Chinese cruelty more desperate and extreme. Unable to defeat the rebels with conventional methods, imperial forces began implementing scorched earth policies that deliberately targeted civilian populations. Entire regions were depopulated, with surviving civilians forced into concentration camps where disease and starvation killed more people than the actual fighting. Foreign observers documented these atrocities with a mixture of horror and fascination. Western diplomats filed reports describing Chinese military tactics that shocked even people familiar with European colonial violence. There's something particularly disturbing about reading accounts of British officials, representatives of a government actively forcing opium addiction on Chinese people, expressing genuine moral outrage at Chinese approaches to suppressing rebellion. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the Opium Wars period was how it revealed the limitations of traditional Chinese assumptions about cultural superiority and cosmic order. For centuries, Chinese intellectuals had assumed that moral virtue would naturally translate into practical success. When virtuous Chinese society was defeated by barbarous foreign powers, it created philosophical problems that Chinese thinkers struggled to resolve. Some Chinese intellectuals concluded that traditional Chinese morality was actually weakness disguised as virtue. Others argued that China needed to become more ruthless and militaristic to compete with Western powers. Still others believed that Chinese civilization needed to be completely reformed or abandoned. These debates continued throughout the late imperial period and influenced Chinese political development well into the 20th century. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was how foreign pressure accelerated the collapse of traditional Chinese social systems without necessarily replacing them with anything better. The examination system, the imperial bureaucracy, the traditional family structures that had maintained social order for centuries were all weakened or destroyed, but the underlying capacity for systematic oppression remained intact, ready to be channeled into new forms. The Opium Wars period demonstrates something crucial about how oppressive systems respond to external pressure. They tend to become more extreme before they collapse, and their collapse doesn't necessarily eliminate the cultural and institutional foundations that made oppression possible in the first place. The end of imperial rule in 1912 was supposed to mark China's transformation from ancient despotism to modern democracy. Instead, it demonstrated something far more disturbing: that you can eliminate emperors without eliminating the imperial mindset, and that systematic cruelty can adapt to new political systems with remarkable creativity and efficiency. The Republic of China, established after the fall of the Qing dynasty, inherited all the institutional infrastructure of imperial oppression: the surveillance networks, the bureaucratic hierarchies, the cultural acceptance of authoritarian control, while adding modern technologies and organizational methods. It was like upgrading from a horse-drawn carriage to an automobile, while keeping the same destination: systematic human exploitation. Yuan Shikai, the first president of the Republic, provides a perfect example of how imperial cruelty evolved rather than disappeared. He had been a general under the imperial system, trained in traditional methods of population control and military organization. When he became president, he simply transferred imperial techniques to republican institutions. He established secret police networks, used modern communication technologies to coordinate surveillance across vast distances, and employed Western-trained military officers to implement traditional Chinese approaches to suppressing dissent. But the most fascinating aspect of early Republican China was how different factions competed by trying to out-cruel each other, using combinations of traditional and modern methods. Warlords who controlled different regions experimented with various approaches to population control, creating what amounted to laboratories for testing new forms of systematic oppression. Some warlords maintained traditional imperial practices: public executions, collective punishment, hereditary service obligations, while adding machine guns and telegraphs for improved efficiency. Others tried to implement Western-style military discipline and bureaucratic organization while preserving Chinese cultural approaches to hierarchy and social control. The results were often more oppressive than anything the imperial system had achieved. Zhang Zuolin, the warlord who controlled Manchuria, created what was essentially a modernized version of the Qin dynasty's mutual responsibility system. Families were organized into groups responsible for each other's behavior, but now the groups were tracked using modern record-keeping systems and coordinated through telegraph networks. Traditional Chinese surveillance techniques, amplified by 20th century technology, proved remarkably effective at controlling large populations. The Kuomintang, when they eventually unified much of China, brought their own innovations to the systematic cruelty tradition. They combined Sun Yat-sen's political theories with Lenin's organizational methods and traditional Chinese bureaucratic practices, creating a hybrid system that was simultaneously modern and ancient, revolutionary and conservative, democratic in theory, and despotic in practice. Chiang Kai-shek's approach to political opposition was particularly creative. He maintained the traditional Chinese practice of collective punishment, executing entire families for individual crimes, while adding modern propaganda techniques and mass media to make these executions into public education events. Political executions became multimedia experiences designed to teach specific lessons to targeted audiences. But the most significant evolution in Chinese cruelty came with the rise of the Communist Party, which took traditional imperial approaches to population control and combined them with modern ideological frameworks and industrial organizational methods. The results were systems of oppression that surpassed imperial achievements in both scale and efficiency. The communist approach to systematic cruelty was revolutionary in its comprehensiveness. Where imperial China had focused primarily on political control and tax extraction, communist China attempted to control every aspect of human existence: economic activity, social relationships, cultural expression, even private thoughts and feelings. It was imperial totalitarianism amplified by 20th century technology and organizational theory. The land reform campaigns of the 1950s provide a perfect example of how traditional Chinese cruelty adapted to modern political circumstances. The basic structure was familiar from imperial times: identify enemies of social order, subject them to public humiliation and execution, redistribute their property to loyal supporters. But the scale and systematization were unprecedented. Millions of people were killed in carefully organized campaigns that combined traditional Chinese concepts of collective justice with modern propaganda and mass mobilization techniques. What's particularly remarkable is how Chinese communist approaches to cruelty incorporated lessons from both imperial Chinese history and Soviet experience. They borrowed traditional Chinese surveillance methods, imperial bureaucratic organization, Confucian concepts of moral education through suffering, and combined them with Leninist party structure, Stalinist purge techniques, and modern industrial management principles. The Cultural Revolution represents the ultimate evolution of Chinese systematic cruelty, a campaign that mobilized the entire population to participate in the destruction of their own cultural heritage, social relationships, and individual identities. It was as if someone had taken the mutual responsibility system, the informant networks, the public execution traditions, and the ideological education methods of imperial China, and turned them into a nationwide psychological warfare campaign against the Chinese people themselves. The genius of the Cultural Revolution was how it made cruelty participatory rather than imposed. Instead of having professional torturers and executioners, ordinary citizens were encouraged to torture and execute each other in the name of revolutionary purity. Children were taught to denounce their parents, students were encouraged to beat their teachers, neighbors were rewarded for destroying neighbors. It was traditional Chinese collective punishment evolved into collective self-destruction. But even as we document these horrors, we should note that Chinese approaches to systematic cruelty were remarkably persistent across different political systems. Imperial dynasties, republican governments, warlord regimes, and communist rule all employed similar basic techniques: mass surveillance, collective punishment, ideological education through suffering, and the use of ordinary citizens as agents of state oppression. The continuity is striking. The same families that had served as imperial informants became Republican secret police, became Communist Party cadres. The same bureaucratic structures that had implemented imperial tax collection became mechanisms for communist resource extraction. The same cultural values that had justified imperial hierarchy were adapted to justify Communist Party authority. What makes Chinese systematic cruelty historically significant isn't just its duration or intensity, but its adaptability. Other oppressive systems have been more brutal in the short term, but few have demonstrated such capacity for evolution and survival across different political environments. Chinese cruelty wasn't just a historical phenomenon, it was a technological and cultural achievement that influenced governmental development throughout East Asia and beyond. The techniques developed in Imperial China, mass surveillance, ideological indoctrination, collective punishment, systematic humiliation, the conversion of ordinary citizens into agents of state control, became standard tools of modern authoritarian governance worldwide. Chinese innovations in systematic oppression were exported along with Chinese cultural influence, shaping governmental approaches across multiple continents and centuries. As we reach the end of our journey through Chinese systematic cruelty, what's most disturbing isn't any individual atrocity or policy, but the cumulative picture of human adaptability. Chinese civilization demonstrated that ordinary people can be trained to accept, participate in, and even celebrate almost any level of systematic oppression if it's properly organized, culturally justified, and consistently maintained over sufficient time. But perhaps there's also something hopeful in this story. If humans can be systematically trained to accept cruelty, they can presumably also be trained to reject it. The same cultural adaptability that made Chinese oppression possible might also make Chinese liberation achievable. The capacity for systematic cruelty reveals the capacity for systematic kindness, if we can figure out how to organize and sustain it as effectively as the Chinese organized and sustained brutality. And on that optimistic note, let's let these dark stories fade into the gentle darkness of sleep, where dreams can transform historical nightmares into whatever your mind needs them to become. The images of emperors and eunuchs, of bound feet and buried concubines, of peasants ground down by impossible taxes and rebels crushed by overwhelming force, let them all dissolve now into the soft fog of approaching sleep. You've traveled with us through 2 millennia of human ingenuity applied to human suffering. Witness the terrible creativity that emerges when power meets imagination without moral restraint. But now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to scatter like autumn leaves, remember that these stories belong to the past. The emperors are gone, their palaces are museums, their torture devices are historical curiosities. The systems that seemed permanent and inescapable eventually crumbled, replaced by new forms of human organization that, whatever their flaws, at least offer the possibility of something better. Let your mind drift away from these tales of systematic cruelty toward whatever peaceful images bring you comfort. Perhaps a quiet garden where no one is watching, no one is judging, no one is calculating how to extract maximum value from your existence. A place where you can simply be human without serving some larger system's appetite for control and suffering. The darkness behind your eyelids is not the darkness of imperial dungeons or execution grounds, but the gentle darkness of rest and restoration. In sleep, you're free from all the systems and hierarchies and cruel innovations we've explored tonight. Your dreams belong to you, ungoverned by mandates from heaven or earth, unmonitored by informants or secret police, unmanned by the terrible creativity of organized oppression. So let these historical nightmares fade into history where they belong, and let your own private night be filled with whatever peace you can find. The story is over now, the cruelty is past, and you, dear listener, are wonderfully, beautifully, temporarily free.